Going back to chapter 6 is taking a few steps backwards in our overall understanding of macroeconomic ideas. Right? So if you'll remember, this is before the introduction of ISLM. Right? So it's a simpler framework within which to describe what's happening in the economy. And where the text starts is by comparing spending with output. This is important because it goes back to a principle that isn't mentioned in the text called Say's law. Anybody familiar with Say's law? Supply creates its own demand. Supply creates its own demand. Which is to say, look, if you make something, then you're going to sell it. Now, what if nobody wants to buy it? Well, then, in an economic sense, it ceases to be a something. If nobody wants to buy the thing that you made, then it's trash. It's dead, it's gone. Okay? To the extent that you make something that somebody else wants, somebody may be willing to buy it. In that case, spending, what gets bought, is equal to output, that which gets made. If you make trash, it just goes in the trash. Okay? People aren't going to spend on something that doesn't exist. And you're not going to make something unless you can sell it or use it yourself. Okay. So why would these two not be equal? In what sense would these two ever not be the same? Now, I make economics lectures. On net, however, I would say that I'm probably a net consumer of economics lectures. I consume way more economics lectures than that which I produce, because I'm constantly listening to other people talk about economics. Okay? That's a little bit unusual. Usually when you specialize in something, right, you make more of it than that which you consume. But I'm a weirdo. Okay? If you're a hamburger maker, chances are you make more hamburgers than those that you consume. Okay. But somebody else is going to consume your hamburgers. It should balance out on net. The two might not be equal for any given subset of the overall economy. Okay? McDonald's might produce more hamburgers, and so its output of hamburgers may be greater than Pizza Hut's production of hamburgers. But on net, we expect them to balance out. I used to work at Pizza Hut, and we would often have a few extra pizzas at the end of the day. So to take them to this really weird place. I don't know, maybe you've heard of it. It's called Blockbuster, right? There's a store a few doors over where they rented videos, right? Have you seen the video of the rise and decline of Blockbuster? It's pretty fascinating, just the number of Blockbusters, how many there were in the world, and how they just like disappeared. Right? But I would take an extra pizza over to Blockbuster, and they would let me borrow a movie for free. Right? I just had to return it by midnight or the next morning so that nobody noticed that it was missing. Okay. I got that on tape. I'm going to go to jail. Okay. There's this complication we throw into things when we think of the unit of analysis as something other than just the global economy. Mankey has this quote from a famous economist that says, I'm a net consumer of haircuts, right? Rather than the producer. I don't make any haircuts, but I get my haircut every 2 weeks or so. So there's an imbalance of trade between me and my barber in terms of goods and services. He doesn't buy my economics lectures. So he buys something from somebody else, who buys something from somebody else, who eventually buys economics lectures. The bilateral trade relationship between any two individuals is probably imbalanced. if you're buying a good or a service from somebody, chances are they're giving you money and not a good or service in return. Actually, that's what we hope for. Right? When it's only goods and services in return, we call that a barter economy, and the transactions costs involved in barter require that there be a mutual incidence of wants across the two individuals. Having money as an available intermediary allows for a lot more exchanges to occur, greater specialization, economic growth. It's frustrating to me, actually a little bit infuriating to me, that the perspective of most of economics is moving from a closed economy to an open economy instead of the other way around. Why don't we presume and understand markets as if they were all just one global market and completely open, which to me is natural. To have an open market is natural. That's what would happen if individuals were trading with individuals and other people were not getting in between. Having a closed economy is only the consequence of some sort of intervention by a special interest group to prevent individuals who would voluntarily want to exchange with one another from being able to do so. And I always say like this, look, America does not trade with Japan. People in America trade with people in Japan. The countries aren't involved in exchange. Individuals in the countries are involved in exchanges with one another. Trying to take this to the national level of analysis causes all kinds of headaches and trouble and problems. The presumption that I would enter into any of these kinds of analyses with is that all goods, all services, all capital, and importantly, all labor is completely mobile. Right? That seems to be the natural way of understanding the pure market function. If the goal is to understand the way that markets work, let's start with a completely open market, including, again, importantly, free mobility of individuals, which is to say, open borders. As an analytical baseline is much more pure, theoretically, than beginning with closed economies. Are you with me? Okay. Should I get off the soapbox now, or should I keep going? I'm tempted to keep going. Well, the consequence of spending and output within a particular closed economy is that also saving and investment within any smaller unit of analysis than the globe will also not be equal. So then, the amount of saving that occurs in the American economy within the borders of America will not necessarily be equal to the amount of investment that occurs within the borders of the nation state known as the United States of America. Okay. Why not? Well, when I go to the barber and have him cut my hair, I give him money. I give him green pieces of paper, he gives me a haircut. That's brilliant. There has been an exchange of financial assets for a service. This can also happen with other kinds of financial assets and other goods and services. I can buy a car from Japan. I will give them green pieces of paper, money, cash. What can somebody in Japan do with American dollars? Apparently they can't buy stuff in Japan with them. That's the first point at which this all goes haywire to me, okay? That's the first point, is that there are differences in currencies. All right? If currencies were all tradable at parity with one another for some hard currency, for some money that we all recognize as money, then there wouldn't be any trouble beyond that. They wouldn't care if they had green pieces of paper called American dollars. They would just keep those and use those to buy stuff with each other. Other countries do that. Ecuador does that. Ecuador just uses American dollars. Okay? Why don't we see global dominance of one currency? Well, we actually do. The American dollar is sort of the global dominant currency. We observe that in part because the American military is larger than the next 6 largest militaries combined, which is to say that it is in some ways a colonial or an imperial consequence. The empire is enforcing its money. Okay. But if it were not the case that America were maintaining its currency's value through military prowess, if it were just doing so by maintaining a good currency, a reliable currency, one that people depended upon and preferred relative to all other world currencies, there should not be a problem. Which is important because the textbook doesn't go much into this, but a large part of the reason that the United States has more imports than exports is because people in other countries would prefer to purchase financial assets denominated in US dollars because the US dollar is a relatively stable currency. People don't want to buy, there are not safe assets that are denominated in other currencies. And so the United States dollar is the default currency for denomination of financial assets for other people to buy. And so there is an inflow of currency into the United States, or of financial investment into the United States. As a result, there has to be an outflow of goods. The two always balance. The next most important thing to notice here is that when we have a money economy, we can go beyond just trade between A and B, and we can involve a whole bunch of other people in exchanges. There may be a difference between the amount of goods that are exported to B from A and the amount of goods that are exported from B to A, from A to B, B to A. These two might not be equal. However, on net, all of the goods exported from A, including financial assets, to all the rest of the world combined, has to be equal to the amount that comes in. One way of thinking about this is to think about your smartphone. And an economist named Jensen did some research a few years ago. It's getting a little bit old now, but looked at the smartphone and said, okay, where does the money spent on smartphones go? Smartphones are typically assembled, put together, at the time anyway, in China. Okay? The final assembly of them occurred in China. However, the screens were often produced in Japan. The hard drives were sometimes produced in Vietnam. The casings were sometimes produced in some other country. What shows up on the trade balances documents, based upon the price of goods being imported, right, is an imbalance between the United States and China. But the value added in China is very, very, very small, because the Chinese who put the phone together had to pay for all of the inputs into the production process to all of those other countries. We think we're buying something from B, but B bought a whole bunch of stuff from all these other places, such that it looks like our balance with this one country is off, but actually this country is involved in a lot of other chains. Okay? So an imbalance of trade requires a much more nuanced analysis. So, again, big picture here. What I see us doing is, instead of going from a closed economy to an open economy, we're going from a world economy that is open, based, a hypothetical, mythical open economy, so to speak, where everyone can trade freely, There is a common currency, and there's also free mobility of capital and people. In this world, we would observe an interesting phenomenon called the law of one price. The idea behind the law of one price is that the price of a pair of shoes is the price of a pair of shoes, no matter where you buy it and no matter where it was made. Given a certain quality, the price of a pair of shoes is the price of a pair of shoes, no matter where you buy it from, as long as the quality is the same. And this would be true for all goods and all services. Now, we might expect oranges to be less expensive in California because the geography and climate makes it easier to produce oranges in California. We might expect oil to be less expensive next to the oil well. Those kinds of things are reasonable. However, given that the transactions costs involved in trade are so low, that is, the cost of transportation for goods and services is very, very low, except for when boats get stuck in the Suez Canal. But in all other circumstances, the cost of transportation is so low, we ought to expect the law of one price to hold. If we do not observe the law of one price, we should first look at the geographic and climate-based issues. Is this good naturally in greater supply in this one spot? But after that, one of these assumptions must be violated. It must be that maybe there are tariffs or interventions into trade or quotas. Maybe there's not a shared currency, and maybe some countries are manipulating their currency in ways different from other countries' manipulation of their currencies. Okay? Maybe there is not free mobility of capital. Maybe you can't invest in a certain country if you want to. And maybe there is not free mobility of people. This is probably the largest remaining economic barrier in the world today, the free mobility of people. Capital is relatively mobile. Goods and services are relatively mobile. People are the least mobile thing in the world today. Michael Clemens at the Center for Global Development studies. Is that right? CGAS. Not the group. Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C. Michael Clemens has written that if we eliminated barriers to movement of people, if we allowed people to migrate freely wherever they wanted to, we would see an increase in global GDP. That globally people would become more well off. Okay. His claim, however, is that global GDP would not increase by 5%. Not that global GDP would increase by 20%. His claim is that global GDP would increase by 300%. That global GDP would triple what we are currently experiencing if we allowed for free mobility of people. It is because people are trapped in institutional settings where they're not able to make full use of their human capital that they are experiencing lower quality of life. You can take a guy in El Salvador who cuts hair and charges $1 per haircut, move him to the United States, and he can charge $10 per haircut overnight. It is because the institutional settings are squelching this person's abilities. And the overall studies show that increasing migration into the United States will hurt low-income workers in the United States. Low-skilled American workers typically will experience a 5 to 10% decrease in salary or income if there is a one standard deviation increase in migration. So the low-income Americans will suffer 5 to 10% loss of income. The trade-off is that the new migrants will experience a 1,000% increase in income. One might even suggest that perhaps those new Americans would be willing to compensate the existing Americans for their small losses. Okay. I'm walking the razor's edge of normative versus positive here, but I am relating primarily research that I've read. Again, from my point of view, in terms of understanding these models, we make them more difficult to enter into by dealing with them according to the current peculiarities of institutions that we are experiencing in the world today, rather than by taking as a baseline a purely open economy, thinking about how that would work, then taking the particular interventions that do exist and understanding how those cause something different from the pure open economy to obtain. That's my preferred way of thinking about things. I also prefer, in general, when thinking about institutions, to begin with a baseline analysis of anarchy, and then introducing institutions onto anarchy, not because I think anarchy is best, but because I think it provides an appropriate baseline for understanding how institutions work. And then moving forward. Okay. We can start then with our basic framework for GDP, for output. And now we can go back and include net exports, which I've been leaving out. You learned this in intro to include net exports, but then I dropped it for most of the analysis for most of the course. We're going to put it back in again. And now we're going to play with algebra. Okay? We can solve this equation for net exports. So then we'd say that net exports is equal to output minus consumption, investment, and government spending. What does this mean? This is what gets produced in the country. This is what gets purchased within that country. Whatever gets made, but not purchased in that country, gets exported. Straightforward so far, I think. Okay. How else might we want to manipulate this? Well, we want to disentangle net exports and say, well, remember, this is imports. I think actually I want to put exports first. Yeah. This is exports minus imports. That's the net for exports. If we're on net an importer, net exports is negative. Okay, so exports minus imports is equal to this. Okay, so I'm just complicating things. Now, we can look at this term and look at this term. Okay? And we can say that when output is greater than, or within a country, output is greater than that which gets purchased within a country, there will be exports that are greater than imports. So if Y is greater than C plus I plus G, then it must also be the case that X is greater than IM. So far, we are just playing with identities here. Okay? We're just playing with accounting identities to understand how economists mess around with these models and think through them. When exports are greater than imports, then we say that we have a trade surplus. When exports are less than imports, we say that we have a trade deficit. This is horrible. This is horrible because we attach normative connotations to the words surplus and deficit. Surplus sounds good, deficit sounds bad. In this context, it shouldn't matter at all. It's unfortunate that we use this language. Who do you think was involved in encouraging the use of this language to describe these things? Who does it benefit to talk about these things this way? It's something to always keep in the back of our minds. Who is benefited by this? In particular, this way of talking about things harkens back to mercantilists. Now, the mercantilists were economic theorists before Adam Smith, generally writing on behalf of some local government. So, a mercantilist would say, we want for there to be more gold flowing into our country than flowing out. In order to get more gold to flow into your country, you need to export goods and services that people will pay gold for, and then more gold will flow into your country. When that gold flows into your country, the government taxes it and gets wealthy. The objective is for the government to become wealthy, for the government to have more gold. Now, in the getting of gold, of course, it is giving up the getting of stuff. What can governments buy with gold? In particular, mercenaries. Okay? Mercantilism was tied with national political dominance. It incorporated a normative goal. So France and French economic mercantilists argued for regulations and laws that resulted in an inflow of gold into France that was good for France, not for the French people, but for the king and the nobility, such that those nobilities were then able to purchase the services of mercenaries and luxuries for themselves, because they would tax all that away from the peasants and make their own lives better off. So this language harkens back to a mercantilist time. Adam Smith's an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations was targeted quite heavily towards mercantilist and mercantilist thought, to show that not only is it wrong, but it's bad and you should feel bad too. Okay? You have to take the theory of moral sentiments in combination in order to get the you should feel bad too part. Okay. Similarly, we talk about a situation where savings is greater than investment as a situation where the country is on net a lender. Again, I think this is ridiculous. Okay. But what it means is that individuals in country A, are consuming less of their income and saving it, but they find opportunities to invest their savings more attractive in other countries than in their own. So that investment is occurring abroad more than at home. This is the amount of savings that's taking place at home. This is the amount of investment that's taking place at home. The difference must be investment that's taking place abroad. And so, on net, in aggregate, if we think about all of the saving that's occurring in the country and all of the investment that's occurring within the country, more investing, or there is at least some investing that's occurring abroad that is not occurring in the United States out of all of the saving that is occurring. We're investing in other places. Okay. If savings is less than investment within a country, right, then we are on net borrowers. And the rhetoric today is that the United States is a net borrower to the rest of the world, and there seems to be some great concern that a lot of the investment in the American economy that's coming from abroad is coming through China. I am not concerned. I don't care where it comes from. I might be stupid. I might not understand geopolitical situations appropriately. However, I don't care at this point. It's not important to me. And when you dig down into it, right, yes, relative to all the other countries that are purchasing financial assets within the United States, China is large. However, England, Brazil, and the Netherlands also have really large positions in the United States, such that there is no danger of monopolistic behavior that will occur here. So I think that the geopolitical rhetoric is fear-mongering and overstated. To go a little bit further with this. Taking this equation, we can rework it to say that net exports are equal to y minus c minus I. Y minus c minus g minus I. This term, you will recall, is savings. Output minus consumption minus government spending is savings within the economy. And so here's where we get this relationship between savings and investment. When savings is larger than investment, right, we've got a positive right-hand side. So then when savings is greater than investment, we also have net exports and we have a trade surplus. When savings is less than investment, net exports is negative, savings is less than investment, so we're a net borrower and we have a trade deficit. There's more imports coming into the United States than exports leaving the United States. It must be the case that people in other countries are buying financial assets within the United States, which makes us a net borrower. One of the things that was purchased at one point was Rockefeller Center. Anybody ever been to Rockefeller Center? Right? This is where the ice skating rink is in downtown New York City, where there's a lot of Christmas activities going on there all the time. It's a beautiful place to go. At one point, a Japanese firm bought Rockefeller Center, and everybody thought it was the end of the world. Except that it wasn't. The end of the world didn't occur until Jack Denny got involved. How can we do a little bit more with this model? The next step would be to put it on a graph. Well, what graph should we use? It's important and relevant that we're using the language of savings and investment. So then what we'll do is we'll put this on the graph for loanable funds. What goes on the y-axis in the market for loanable funds? The interest rate. The y-axis is the quantity of loanable funds exchanged, or what I'm going to put here is I and S, investment and savings. We begin our development of this graph by assuming that savings, right, which is y minus c minus g, that's savings. We're gonna set that as constant for the time being. We're gonna say savings is inelastic. There is a certain amount of savings that is occurring in our world. What determines that? The level of income, individual preferences for consumption, and government spending. We'll allow this to move later on, but we can say that as far as savings is concerned, it is not affected by the interest rate. Interest rates don't affect savings in this context. Then we will throw on here a demand curve for loanable funds. Who is it that demands loanable funds? Borrowers, investors. So this is going to be investment as a function of the interest rate. And of course, we recognize that it's downward sloping, so then the IDR is less than 0. It's downward sloping. That's all I'm saying there. Okay. Now the chapter is very emphatic about assuming that we are talking about a small open economy. Why small, why open at this stage of analysis? Similar to the way we talk about international trade for goods and services. We're talking about shoes. We assume that there is this law of one price that obtains. In other words, if the market is closed, there might be a domestic price for shoes made and purchased within the United States. Once it's opened up, once there are no barriers to trade, we expect that the domestic price for shoes will be equal to the world price for shoes. Whatever price you can buy shoes somewhere else in the world will end up being the price that you can buy shoes in the United States. Similarly, wherever an investor can place their money will be based upon the interest rate that they can expect to return on that investment. And that interest rate could be the same interest rate as within the small open economy, or the interest rate in the rest of the world could be different from it. It could be higher. If you're an American investor and there's a certain amount of savings that's occurring in your country, but investment opportunities abroad are better than investment opportunities in the United States, then this difference, the quantity demanded being less than the quantity supplied, there is a surplus of loanable funds, right? This will be related to exports, Y, because Americans will be investing some of the money that they saved abroad. They'll be buying financial assets in other countries, and then there will be imports occurring. Notice it's to the left of the supply curve, such that the difference is imports into the United States. The next few steps of the process here are to think about causal factors that would result in each of these curves shifting one direction or another, and then thinking through what would be the effect in terms of flows of goods and services across borders. So we could say, what happens if a new idea is discovered and investment opportunities in the United States increase dramatically? We have a better set of ideas that is looking for investment. We've got a great idea. This is going to be really super productive. In that case, what would happen? Foreigners would start investing in the United States because the opportunities in the United States would be better, which would result in net exports rather than imports. Similarly, we could think through policies that would cause the supply curve to shift. What might those be? Changes in consumption or government spending. And so on and so forth. The second half of the chapter deals with exchange rates. And this has to do with the buying and selling of foreign currencies for the purposes of engaging in exchanges. This part is why I don't like to get into this stuff, because it assumes that countries should and will be engaged in manipulation of exchange rates in an effort to affect trade flows. And in starting from my baseline idea of a common currency, or currencies that are not being manipulated by central banks, you would end up not having an exchange rate that is any different from what the textbook calls the purchasing power parity, where you return to the idea of the law of one price in the long run. Okay, you can exchange $1 for 100 yen. Brilliant. Okay, but that $1 will buy a Coke in the United States, and that 100 yen will also buy a Coke in Japan. Should I give a damn about whether I'm using dollars or yen? Nationalistic tendency. When exchange rates change, when the dollar appreciates, for example. When the dollar appreciates, it means that you can buy more of the foreign currency with the dollar. So you used to be able to buy 100 yen with a dollar. Now you can buy 120 yen with a dollar. Okay? That appreciation of the dollar might mean nothing if at the same time the price of a Coke in Japan has increased to 120 yen. The purchasing power parity might remain the same. And I would expect it to. I would expect the purchasing power parity to remain constant, except for manipulation of currencies or trade policies on behalf of special interest groups within certain countries. Wherever we don't observe purchasing power parity, in other words, we ought to go looking for some sort of special interest group that is trying to use government to intervene on its behalf. And again, to me today, the most important variable, the most important price that is not at purchasing power parity is labor, because the most constrained factor internationally is mobility of labor. Okay, that's all I got for you today. I think that what is going to happen is that on Wednesday, I will be giving a slightly different lecture. Which is to say that I will post this video, and I will post Wednesday's video, and you should probably watch Wednesday's video, so that you get a full picture of what happens with all this material. Any other questions for me today? Thanks for your attention.